1:15. So we always tend to run overtime with our events. So I'm thinking that in the interest of trying to keep the time, I might make a start, and people will obviously just continue to join. So good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for making time to be with us this afternoon. Before we get started, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So this afternoon's webinar is focused on trying to better understand what is consumer-led research. And before we delve into that topic, we'd like to start by asking everyone a question. So Fiona, if you could launch the poll, that would be great. We want to get a better idea. Here's the question. So we want to get a better idea of whether people think there is a difference between consumer involvement in research and consumer-led research. So if you could just answer yes, no, or not sure. There is no right or wrong answer at this stage. It's whatever you feel to be true. We just want to get a rough idea of how many people perceive there to be a difference between the two out of everyone attending today. So we'll give everyone a minute to answer that question. I know we've still got people logging on. And if you have just joined us, we are recording today's session for the convenience of people that can't make it this afternoon. We've had a lot of requests from people to record today's session so that it's available for them to access at a later point. And we've just popped a question up on the screen. What is consumer-led research? We just want to know if you perceive there to be a difference between consumer involvement in research and consumer-led research. So just please answer yes, no, or not sure, and we'll display those results on the screen in just a moment.
Yeah, no, we've got 89% of everybody who's answered, so we probably should end.
Excellent.
I might end this poll and we can just share with everyone.
That'd be good. Okay, so we can see that the majority of people here today think there is a difference between involvement and consumer-led research, or they're either not sure. And that's actually really good, because that's part of the reason we're here today, to try and work out what that difference is. So thank you very much to everyone for answering that, that question. So today's session was inspired by a webinar series that we ran last year on demystifying consumer and community involvement in research. As part of the outcomes of that series, we produced a reflections paper, which included or highlighted, I suppose, some areas requiring further attention and discussion. And we took those topics to a poll with our people in our database just before Christmas last year, to further determine which areas people would like to see included in the 2022 Whitecoats Foundation webinar agenda. And of course, what is consumer-led research made it or ranked in the top 3 topics of interest. So it's definitely a genuine area of interest and concern for people. It's not something that we just decided to unpack for fun, I can assure you. And so from that first webinar series, what we actually learned was that consumer involvement in research is where consumers and the community actively work with researchers and research organisations to help shape decisions relating to health research priorities, policy and practice. So again, where does consumer-led research fit into that definition, and how might it be different? So we received a lot of questions in advance of today's webinar. Which is great. We had people asking us to share examples of consumer-led research, provide pragmatic steps on how to ensure there's a pathway for consumer-led research to be practiced. We're hoping that through the course of today's session, that we will answer some of those questions, but I just want to flag that the primary purpose of today's session is to really first and foremost understand what we mean when we're referring to consumer-led research. I think that's an important step. We also received some questions from people asking us about how to effectively involve consumers in research. And I just want to refer people to the webinar series that we ran last year. The recordings of both those sessions are available on our website. And there's also a reflections paper that we produced that's available. It's free to download that you can refer to, that includes lots of useful tips and examples and information. And of course, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to the White Coats Foundation. We are aiming to reserve the last half an hour to 20 minutes of this session today for Q&A from attendees and the panel. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A channel, and we'll just reserve the chat channel for general commentary, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we possibly can today. So here today to help us hopefully bring some clarity and consensus on what consumer-led research is a wonderful panel of speakers that have kindly given up their time to share their thoughts and views on this topic. And that includes Keith Donahoe, who is a consumer advocate with the VCCC Alliance and Parkville Precinct. We've got Clarissa Schilstra, who's a PhD candidate, consumer advocate, discipline of paediatrics, School of Clinical Medicine, University of New South Wales, and Behavioural Sciences Unit, Kids Cancer Centre, Sydney Children's Hospital. We've got Helen Rickards, who's the Director of Policy and Support, Health and Medical Research Office, Australian Government Department of Health, and Adam Chapman, who's the Director of Priorities and International Engagement in the Research Quality and Priorities branch at NHMRC. So thank you to all of you for joining us. But right now, I would like to introduce and welcome Melinda Cruz, who will be thankfully co-facilitating this. I'm going to all the help I can get navigating this topic. And Melinda is the mother of 3 premature babies and the co-founder of the Miracle Babies Foundation, which is Australia's largest and leading neonatal consumer group. She's also been a chief investigator on the MRFF funded wheat trial, withholding or continuing enteral feeds during transfusion. And she's also the winner of the inaugural Australian Clinical Trials Alliance Consumer Involvement Award. And she's co-authored more than 16 publications in peer-reviewed journals. But even with all that experience, I know Melinda and I have had some discussions offline. Yeah, that baffles her. And I think Melinda's, you've said that you feel a bit confused about where you fit into this, given your experience. And we both kind of agree that consumer-led research tends to imply that there is a significant level of consumer ownership in the research process from start to finish. So I'm now going to hand over to you. Very much looking forward to you sharing your thoughts and views on this. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I agree. We've definitely gone back and forth and trying to see if we can come up with, a definition for either of them. So thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everybody as well. I think Fiona's going to put some slides up. So I'll have a little bit, I guess, of a discussion of where I am, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And then we can go into having the chat. So like you said, I'm the mum of 3 beautiful boys that were all born early. Before that, so I say BC, or before children, I've got a science degree in genetics, and my life was taking a very different path. And then these 3 beautiful boys came along. It was my middle son, Dylan, his birth at 27 weeks. He was resuscitated when he was born, spent 9 weeks in hospital before we brought him home. And just that experience really, I guess, changed the whole agenda of my life. In 2005, a year after he was born, is when I founded Miracle Babies. And originally it was more of like a support group and a way to connect families, because that's what happened when we got discharged from hospital. Felt very disengaged, not a lot of programs, parents, who were going through the same thing. How could we get long-term support for what we had gone through? So then, maybe next slide, Fiona, thank you. So we were kind of plodding along very well as a consumer organisation and very parent family program focused. Then in 2012, I got a phone call from this gentleman, Professor William Tano-Morty, a researcher who basically said to me, have you thought about research? And at the time we hadn't. So I thought it was one of those things that was kind of happening. It was doing really well. Knew that in our NICUs, you know, thankfully our babies have access to really high quality care. And it wasn't really the space that we thought we were stepping into. So I actually said to him, why would you need us? And these were the things that he spoke to me about. Was one, that the uptake into trials, particularly in neonatal or perinatal trials, is really quite low. I kind of laughed a little bit and said, yeah, because, you know, it's actually really difficult to, as an adult, you say yes to a trial for yourself, but to actually make that decision for your baby can be quite difficult. Two, you know, he told me it makes sense if you're the patients, it makes sense to involve you and have that discussion, but also that it was policy. So if you just flick to the next slide. So in 2004, in their model framework, the NHMRC actually encouraged the appointment of consumers as decision makers in research. So this was 2004. Like I said, he approached me in 2012. So in the neonatal space, 8 years had gone by since the recommendation and nothing had happened. There had been no consumer involvement, but it wasn't only here. Sorry, next slide. In places like the UK, you know, the same thing, that our research is carried out with or by the public rather than to, about, or for them, and that it should be driven by the needs of patients and public, engaged at every stage, and that no funding would be allocated unless consumers have been engaged. So from a policy perspective, moving forward, there was that directive, but was it actually happening? So that's the way that we kind of got connected. And then next slide. Since 2012, and I know, Kristen, you alluded to some of this in your introduction, these are some of the things that I've been really fortunate and grateful and humble to be invited and take part in. So I was appointed as an honorary research associate with NHMRC CTC, and then was put as a first-time investigator, as an associate investigator on the LIFT trial, which was the first. We don't know if it's the first in the world, but we know it was definitely the first in Australia. From that, joined the PSANTS, which is the Perinatal Society of Australia and New Zealand, their Consumer Advisory Panel, their Clinical Trials Executive Committee, and then the Trials Development Committee, also with NHMRC. From that, I was then invited onto another, quite a bit of series of other trials, also as an associate investigator. Through the foundation, we were able to help contribute to, you know, disseminating results of different trials. And then it kind of changed a little bit in terms of our involvement, where now I was starting to take a different kind of role. So one of the biggest things that happened, and you can see that's exactly why we won the award, was I helped obtain a waiver of consent for the Torpedo 3060 trial. So this is the amount of oxygen that's given to babies when they're born and being resuscitated. So the reason this was really important was there hadn't been a trial before that where waiver of consent was granted. I actually had to go and present physically to the ethics committee. So to stand up in the room as a parent and you know, give my perspective and be a voice for all those parents on why this trial could offer waiver of consent. And there was many considerations. It's a comparative trial. It's two practices that were already happening. But we did get waiver of consent. So that was the first trial that's happened in Australia, and it's not the last. We've actually been successful in subsequent trials because of this one. And then other involvement, so the FICARE, which is Family Integrated Care, it's a trial that started in Canada, and then Australia and New Zealand also joined that. We led the consumer contribution to that. And then in 2018 was the first time I was appointed as a chief investigator on the wheat trial. And then this year I've also been appointed onto another trial as a chief investigator. As you said, also to date, co-authored 16 publications. Next slide. So for us, and I know that we'll have this discussion, we haven't really made that big distinction between consumer led and participation. What we wanted to do, taking it further, so we know from 2012 we have made really considerable, I guess, inroads in terms of having consumer involvement, and there are no neonatal trials that happen in Australia that don't have some aspect of a parent participation or what it may be involved. And that's from the beginning before it goes into application stage. So what we want to do in our space is that hopefully that we can design and train and educate our patients or our parents as partners. We are looking at almost like the life-saving model where they have a bronze, silver, gold, and hopefully get parents, because it's really hard, like it's really daunting to be able to come into participate in research. From that, create a global registration or a register of parent partners. So that can be twofold, you know, that researchers can actually go to the register and find parents, because that's been a really big thing for us, is like, how do you connect people? And then from that, we're looking at how we can use, and we have used the word here, led, parent and consumer-led priority settings. And the reason that they came about, you can probably take the slides down so we can chat. So the reason that that came about was we held last year in November, it's World Prematurity Month. So we held a series of Facebook Lives, and one of them included our parent reps. So we have consumer reps, and actually having the discussion. And from our perspective, we're really like, it's like I said, it's humbling and it's amazing that we get the opportunity to take part in research, but then also we have parents that want to actually be part of, you know, the priority setting in terms of questions. We're the ones with the lived experience. So we're the ones that know in real life terms, these are the things that are happening with our children. Why aren't those things being studied? So we actually had those kind of discussions. And for us, you know, when it comes to, I guess, this topic, you know, like I said with you, Christine, like, is the words interchangeable? In terms of, we've always used the words consumer participation, involvement, engagement. When we talk about it, we think that consumer-led would be something that you're involved in every stage in terms of planning, developing, educating across all those stages rather than individual components. So yeah, I don't know. I'm really happy that we're actually having this discussion. And I think part of the biggest thing is, do we actually know what consumers want? Like, how involved do they actually want to be? When we talk about it with our consumers, do they actually want to be the ones that are doing the doing? You know, for me, when I'm invited onto a project, even like, you know, I showed that we won that award, and ACTA have called it an involvement award for that reason. It's always been me taking part in someone else's project. So it's being led meant that we're the ones that are actually leading the entire project and inviting people onto that. Or is it more about having that involvement across the scope? Because the importance to parents may not be actually doing the doing, but the outcome. What questions being asked and what the outcome is.
Thank you so much for that, Melinda. And I've just got a quick question before maybe we hand over to Keith.
Yeah.
I can see that time's already slipping away. Probably should have allocated 2 hours to this session.
Yeah.
Adding that consumer-led priority to your framework, was that consumer-driven? Was that a request by consumers? And so did they sort of, did you get any information from them about what they meant when they were talking about consumer-led research?
Well, I think because it's priority setting, it's more about being able to create the topic that gets researched.
Right.
Yeah. Because that's where they come from. And it was really interesting that a lot of what they talk about, so say, for example, in a NICU, when you look at the research in terms of how much oxygen do you give a baby when they're born, that's not a question a parent would come up with. That's definitely like a researcher kind of question. But when you look at long-term developmental delays, what's happening, you know, when children are going to school, you know, all of those kind of things, that's really hard, I guess, for a researcher to then come up with those kind of questions, but that matters to families, it matters to parents. So then that becomes research that is really applicable and has real life benefits, but those kind of questions can only come from the people who are living it. So I think from our point of view with families is, yeah, they want that opportunity, but I don't know, and that's what I was saying, what do consumers actually want? I don't know if they want to have, you know, their hands in the clay and actually be running all the parts of the research. You know, there is kind of that aspect that the researchers are the experts, but being able to be part of the discussion, be at the table, help set the questions, and that we can, you know, help be part of that solution.
And yeah, and I think, you know, being part of developing those research questions and prioritizing those questions can be considered consumer involvement. I mean, that's something we talk about as part of consumer involvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, becoming consumer led at that point. I could ask you so many more questions, but I think maybe at this point we should throw to
bring everybody in.
yeah.
So I'm really honoured that I get to introduce you, Keith. So Keith's background, he served on private company and non-for-profit boards. He was a corporate IT professional, including as a CEO of a software development company that he founded many years ago. But like me, and we'll hear from Clarissa a little bit later too, is here because of personal experience. So Keith underwent significant hospitalisation for head and neck cancer several years ago, an event which led him to combining his strategic corporate background with his interest in representing consumers in decision-making within the health system. He's now active consumer advocate in many areas of health service decision-making, including a wide variety of management and governance committees in the Parkville precinct, including the Melbourne Health Board Advisory Committee, and as Christine mentioned earlier, the VCCC Alliance Cancer Consumer Advisory Committee, and involved with their strategic program plan on the steering committee for implementing data-driven value-based cancer services. Following a prostate cancer diagnosis, Keith has had extensive involvement in cancer research projects, primarily representing the consumer view on steering and governance committees within, and this is the dual cancer stream life experience. So thank you so much, Keith, for being here.
You might want to come off mute. Yep.
Thank you very much, Melissa. That was Melinda, a powerful presentation of yours. Thank you, and a fulsome introduction to me.
Welcome.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional people on the land where we are widely meeting today, and to traditional and community elders who may be present. We all hope medical research leads to better outcomes for their various mobs and all of us. So on my opening slide, I've included the VCCC Alliance partners on this slide, just for those who aren't familiar with the acronym VCCC, which is Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre Alliance, and that's about some 10 partners who I variously represent consumer views to. So my background has been very eloquently expressed by Melinda, but effectively I'm a dual-stream cancer patient active in pro bono consumer representation and health service decision-making over the past 7 years. And I'm also engaged in cancer research for the past 6 years, representing consumer lived experience actively alongside researchers and a consumer voice on strategic governance and steering groups across the Melbourne Parkville precinct. So today's topic, consumer-led research. The term appears has been around for quite a while and appears to come from mental health over the last 20 years. Without doubt, it is defined differently in many quarters, and that's why we're here today. And at the minimum, any consumer engagement, partnership, co-design is extremely welcome to produce better research and patient outcomes. My current definition, for what it's worth, is research which includes consumers in active governance roles, potentially being active associate investigators and active authors of the outcome. I'm often asked about examples of consumer-led research to help others come to grips with this somewhat positive statement. And I generally refer them and you to a special edition of the Research Australia magazine Inspire, issue 21 of September 2021, The Consumer's Role in Health and Medical Research, which is an excellent 72-page compendium of examples from across Australia. This is freely available online at issue.com. I only know about this magazine as I did have a small feature in it. They summarise the myriad benefits of consulting with the consumer include greater accountability, improved quality and outcomes, decreased costs, more effective research translation, and improved public confidence in research. Can't ask for more than that. So to go into a particular recent example where I have contributed, which is the can-eat pathway development and, importantly, implementation. The aims of this project were to reduce malnutrition in all streams of cancer patients using trusted sources of nutrition information. This was an initiative of the Victorian Government, with Peter Mack providing statewide leadership and project management, with a special hat tip to Janelle Loriga and her team. Consumer involvement was at 3 levels: governance, joining statewide representation from health services, GPs, and the University of Melbourne implementation scientists were to consumers, myself included. Focus groups and workshops providing valuable advice and feedback on the resources produced. That was utilising some 40 consumers. And thirdly, funding patient and carer questionnaires for baseline and effectiveness evaluation. Stage 1 funding of the project developed the resources, and stage 2 funding was the implementation of the resources into clinical practice. This was effectively what I now know technically as an implementation science intervention using experience-based co-design, EBCD methodology, and trialling of the acceptability of 47 new graphically designed resources at 7 implementation sites across both health services and primary care. Importantly, the 2 governance consumers in the project were active members of the statewide governance committee and actively involved and named in the project publication across many forums. Now, as I finish up, I'd like to present my view of the components of a great consumer-led research project and what can have, and it can have the following key ingredients for success: a reasonable budget, strong institutional commitment to enabling consumer-led research, a consumer-only governance structure, an education framework to empower the consumer governance, consumers reviewing submissions from researchers and selecting an area of research, consumers defining the research question and determining the approach, consumers engaging researchers to conduct the research, consumers being accountable for the proposal, the conducting of the research, and the publication of results, and finally, a reasonable time period, say 2 to 3 years for a modest project. I hope that challenges some of your ideas, and for others, it may well be no chance. But, In finishing, it's worth quoting another mental health truism: nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, and I'll naturally welcome your questions, most of which I may be able to answer.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that fabulous presentation. It was interesting that you noted that the definition seems to stem from the mental health space for consumer-led research, because I came across a journal article in BMC Psychiatry, and I don't know if anyone here today has heard of Partners in Recovery, which is an Australia-wide initiative designed to provide service coordination and brokerage for individuals with severe and persistent mental illness. One of the PIR services engaged a consumer-led research team to evaluate the service from the perspective of consumers. And in that journal article, they include a definition of consumer-led research. And they talk about consumer-led research being very distinct from other forms of consumer involvement in research, in that consumer researchers hold ultimate decision-making responsibility for all aspects of the research process, including designing the research question, developing the research method, data collection, analysis, and report writing. They do acknowledge that the consumers who designed and conducted the research were supported by non-consumer academic researchers who provided consultation, suggestions, and methodological support. I just wanted to sort of circle back to you on that, and as it relates to the definition you provided on consumer-led research, which you talked about consumers holding an active role in the research process. But as I mentioned earlier, consumer involvement also requires active partnership. So where does the distinction lie? I know it's tricky, and you can throw to Adam if you like. Maybe he might have an answer.
It is tricky. It really, I suppose, as Adam, I hope I'm not putting words into Adam's mouth, but as Adam would say, NH and MRC really don't want to get too much definition here, and really leave it up to the consumer. And but I'm sorry, Adam, if I'm.
No, that's all. That's true. You know, we're not really going to want to, you know, run out and say, well, this is what consumer-led research is. But you know, we kind of we're doing our best to, you know, facilitate the consumer engagement broadly. But I'll talk about that in my brief presentation anyway.
But it is part of the discussion. If you have a look in the chat, there is a comment that says they're all fantastic examples of consumer engagement, but it's not led. And that's in our space. That's exactly like we've always, like those three words, it's either participation, involved, or you're engaged. But even as a CI, I haven't felt like I've been a part of a project that I'm actually leading it. And that's part of being, I guess, a partnership. So
that's right, and this is a culture change we're talking about, and that really is why I presented a relatively provocative design of forward-led consumer design, so that there is a bit more of a roadmap of tick boxes, if you like, to achieve that. And semantics is a real problem. And as long as you feel like it's consumer-led, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and look, I just noted in the chat that Janelle Bowden commented, partnership is the ultimate aim, and I agree. Any form of consumer involvement is great, but I think that sometimes the terms are being used interchangeably, and it's just when we mean something different, and it's creating confusion. Just to reference another article that I came across my way on patient-led research for COVID, the article referenced or noted actually several medical establishments and leading publishers advocating for research that involves patients in decision making, including the British Medical Journal, which has set up partnerships with patients and the public to encourage this type of work, and also the US-based Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which promotes research guided by patients in the US. But then they go on to say that a step beyond this work is patient-led research, in which patients are not only involved, but actually leading the research. So it seems to be that I suppose the distinction in the way I perceive it tends to lie in the level of control that consumers have in the process. As I said earlier, I think any form of involvement is important, and I don't think we should be saying one is more important than the other, but they are terms that seem to be creating some confusion in this space. Maybe on that note, I'll introduce Clarissa Schilstra. So Clarissa is a two-time cancer survivor, having undergone treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia at age 3 and 13. She has 10 years experience in health research advocacy, and currently Clarissa serves as a consumer representative for the WHO Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer and the International Late Effects from Childhood Cancer Guidelines Harmonisation Group. So with the WHO, Clarissa is co-leading the development of guidelines for caring for the physical and psychosocial well-being of childhood cancer survivors. And she's very passionate about ensuring consumers are involved in and given leadership opportunities at all stages of research, development, conduct, and dissemination. So Clarissa, I might hand over to you now.
Thank you for that introduction, Christine. And I'll just warn everyone, my 1-year-old is at home today. So if you hear any background noise, apologies for that. I'll just share one slide briefly. Here we go. Oops. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, here we go. Okay. So as Christine mentioned, my name is Clarissa. I'm a cancer survivor. So I was diagnosed with leukemia when I was 3 and again at 13 years old. Going through cancer treatment as a teenager was just a starkly different experience than going through it as a child. So treatment for leukemia involves about 2.5 years of chemotherapy. And for me, that also included radiation to my head at the time. And so due to the physical impact of treatment, but also the impact to my immune system, I had to miss 2.5 years of school. So basically most of middle school and a little bit of high school as well. And so I ended up feeling at the end of treatment like the social impact had been so much more difficult to deal with than the emotional, and it had an emotional consequence, but was more difficult to deal with than the physical impacts of treatment. And so I also felt like there had just not been enough resources to support my social well-being during and after treatment. And I was really determined to help fix that for other young people diagnosed with cancer in the future. And so following treatment, I started writing a blog for young people with cancer, thinking maybe if I get some advice out there about what strategies worked for me to deal with some of these challenges, I might be able to make a difference. And I was really thankful for an opportunity to turn that into a book after that. So if you're interested, my book is available on my website there or on Amazon if you search my name. It's called Riding the Cancer Coaster: Survival Guide for Teens and Young Adults. But in the process of doing that writing and really reflecting on my experiences, I felt like I still wanted to do more. So I started getting involved in advocacy. And I started doing that by joining the Patient Advisory Council for the Department of Pediatric Oncology at Johns Hopkins in the US, which is where I was treated. And that was a really nice experience to start to be involved in advising on quality improvement projects for that department. And when I went off to university, in Duke University in the US, I ended up kind of continuing that advocacy work by joining the Adolescent and Young Adult Cancer Council as the hospital there was developing their adolescent and young adult cancer program. So that was the first time I really started to engage in topics that were really relevant to me, and particularly to the youth cancer experience, not necessarily being on on a committee with other parents and adults, but really being involved with other young people in driving change. So that's really when I got excited about, wow, there's such a need and a importance for young people's voices to be heard, because at that point, it was mostly parents being involved in those kinds of advocacy activities. And so after graduating from university, I decided to pursue a career in research related to the psychosocial impact of cancer treatment on young people. I'm one of those crazy cancer survivors that can't get enough and wants to be as involved in the space as possible. And so I began working with the behavioral sciences unit team here in Australia. We made the move for my partner's work, but I was really excited to find this awesome research team that's really dedicated to this area that I'm so passionate about. And it was really through the guidance and support of my supervisor, Dr. Joanna Fardell, as well as the director of the Behavioral Sciences Unit, Professor Claire Wakefield, that I started to have opportunities to channel both my personal experience and my professional expertise that I was developing into some sort of combination where I could begin to become an associate investigator on grants or be involved in advising on the development of new projects. And so that was really exciting to start to make this shift from really healthcare advocacy into this research advocacy space. And so what I started to notice as I began being a research advocate in particular was really that I was being invited to be an associate investigator on projects, but I found myself more often than not being more of a tick box in the part of these grant application processes. So there needed to be a consumer who had reviewed everything. And so my name was added on and I was given the grant to review. But then after the submission period ended, I was rarely updated as to whether or not the grant was successful, whether or not there was opportunities for further involvement in the project. And so I found that a little bit inconsistent. So for me, that's when I started to recognize there might be some spectrum in this consumer engagement, involvement, and leadership collection of terms. And following that, I was really more interested in becoming more of a leader in projects. I was developing this area of research expertise, but I also felt like the research that's being conducted really needs to originate from young people so that we know that it's relevant and important to them and will address things that actually matter. And so that's when I started pursuing other opportunities that really shift a little bit more into that leadership space. Through my own PhD, I had the opportunity to engage with adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. I was really determined that the first part of my PhD was setting research priorities with young people so that the rest of the research I would conduct would be relevant and important. So we brought together about 6 survivors for a one-day workshop where we had 2 pretty long focus group discussions all around what their research priorities were. And not surprisingly, they highlighted that social well-being was a really top area of research priority for them, given the impacts on their education and employment, and even relationships with friends and romantic partners after diagnosis. And so having that experience was really powerful to me because I think it really showed me that consumer engagement and involvement can have a significant impact. And I think touching on what Melinda and Keith have said, young people definitely have variable interests when it comes to involvement and engagement and leadership. And I think for the young people that were involved in the workshop, they were really happy with that engagement level of being involved, where they were consulted about priorities and they were not really in a life stage where they were ready to be committing to full-on leadership of a project or consistent involvement over a period of time. But I definitely was. And so that's something I started looking for outside of my own research work. And thanks to Professor Wakefield, I was invited then to participate in this World Health Organization Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer project, which is developing a survey to globally assess the lived experience of long-term cancer survivors, both of childhood and adult cancer, and their family members. And that was really the first time I experienced what consumer-led research could be like, because the tables turned. And so I, as a consumer, as well as one of the parents that was on the committee and another young man who was a cancer survivor, were really given the reins to say, these are the domains that we want to assess in this survey. These are the ways that we think these questions should be asked. These are the people that we think we should be asking them of. And we were given the leadership and ownership over the project to make those decisions. And the researchers and clinicians were really there on the committee for us to consult and get guidance from, rather than for them to direct us and us be giving the consultation. And so that was a really empowering experience for me, because I think for the first time, I felt like myself as a consumer and the parent and other young person involved, we really had an opportunity to create change that we thought was important. And we had more capacity and platform to share our voices and also have ownership over the project. So that's sort of where I am at with this. I feel like consumer-led research is that one end of the spectrum, and consumer involvement is sort of at the other. And it's variable levels, but I do think, to me, leadership is very different than involvement and engagement, and definitely includes a lot more ownership and responsibility over a project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Clarissa. I just, after the slides went out, I lost where you were on the screen. There you are. Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. So I suppose just reflecting back on what you've said, and maybe in summary, so for something to be classified consumer-led, do you think that consumers need to have full control over over a project for it to be classified as consumer-led from the beginning to the end, or is being assigned a defined level of control in the research process? Do you also consider that to be consumer-led research?
That's a really good question, Christine. I think personally, I feel like having a defined leadership role is really important, because I think that ensures consistency of involvement, and it prevents things like you sort of dropping off in terms of the email updates about the study and sort of not being included in the long-term conduct and dissemination of the outcomes, because I think that's where leadership is really important. Because to date, with involvement, consumers very easily sort of fall off the radar after the study's been developed, because it was just a priority setting exercise, or they fall off the radar because it's finished being conducted, but they're not really part of the dissemination stage. And so I think leadership is really key to make sure that there's a consumer there from step one all the way to the end of the research being disseminated.
Mm-hmm. And Clarissa, I kind of agree with you a little bit in terms of, in the beginning, when you said it feels a little bit token, there would be projects that I would be put on as an AI, and sometimes I think, oh, I didn't really do anything, but it was just more that they actually had that. But I think there's definitely been, and that's why the discussion's so exciting, like just watching it evolve. So in the beginning, I remember having a discussion with a doctor and a researcher, and they seemed to be really apprehensive of letting consumers in to a certain degree. And one of the comments, I mean, it was a private conversation, but he said, you know, some of us are a little bit worried about letting the crazies in. And then he said, no, not you. But just, you know, because it was such a big change from them being the researchers to then kind of opening the door, but then actually watching it evolve. And then also, I guess, you know, the consideration of that crossover of when does a consumer stay a consumer or they become a professional. Like you say, you know, you're studying for your PhD, so then you've got professional consumers, and then does that change things? So yeah, no, it's definitely very interesting.
If I could just add to that as well, that Melinda, that really is the challenge, is for the consumer not to become the researcher, and which is the model we look at the moment. And as Clarissa says, leadership is important, but you can be leaders without doing the research. Mm-hmm. And but it's important that there is some accountability of the consumer for the whole process, ideally back to the funder. And but I think that it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, this is how we do it now, and so where does the consumer go fit in as a researcher? And that's definitely the key, that they're not the researcher, but they're accountable for the result.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can bring Helen into the conversation. So I'm introducing you. So Helen Rickards is the Director of Policy Support within the Health and Medical Research Office at the Department of Health and Aged Care. For the past 10 years, she's worked on federal government grant funding programs. The majority of this time has been spent working on health and medical research grant programs, previously through the NHMRC, and more recently through the Medical Research Future Fund. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Melinda. Fiona, I think you're going to share some slides for me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. As Melinda said, I'm Helen Rickards. I'm joining from Ngunnawal country today. I'm a director within the Health and Medical Research Office at the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care. And our office's main responsibility is implementation of the Medical Research Future Fund. We also call it the MRFF for those people that aren't so across it. So I thought for my kind of introduction today, I would give you a bit of an overview of the MRFF and how we're sort of currently involving consumers in MRFF funded research. So for those that aren't aware, there are two main complementary Australian government health and medical research funding streams. These are the National Health and Medical Research Council, and they tend to fund more investigator-led research. And Adam Chapman, who's on the panel, is representing NHMRC today, so you'll hear more about that from him later. The other main funder is the Medical Research Future Fund. And generally we do more priority-driven research with a focus on research translation. The object of the MRFF, and this is in our Act, is to improve the health and wellbeing of Australians. We do this by giving out government funding grants to support medical research and medical innovation. One of the key things about the MRFF is that it is relatively new. It was only established in 2015, which brings me to the next slide, please, Fiona. So this slide, sorry if that graph is a bit complex, but I guess the reason for showing this graph is to just show that the MRFF is young, and you can see over the years that our disbursements have been growing very rapidly. Since 2015, we've already given out over $2 billion worth of grant funding. And from this financial year forwards, it's projected that our disbursements will sort of stabilise at $650 million per year. So I think one of the reasons for me in showing this slide is to just say that, we're young, we're listening and we're learning. We really want to improve and do things better into the future. Next slide, please, Fiona. So I thought I would just quickly explain the framework for how we disperse MRFF funds. So starting on the left-hand side, we've got the MRFF Act, and that's the legal framework which sort of dictates how we disperse funds. We then have the Australian Medical Research and Innovation Strategy and the priorities, and they're sort of two overarching guidance documents that are developed by our independent advisory board known as AMRAB. And then under those two big guiding documents, we have the MRFF 10-year investment plan. And that sort of outlines the mechanism for how we translate the strategy and priorities into funding disbursements, I suppose. Within that 10-year investment plan, there are 4 themes. And from those 4 themes, there's then 21 initiatives. And then as we move from left to right across that slide there, under every initiative, there's multiple grant opportunities that are run. And then from each grant opportunity, there's funded grants, and that's where the research happens and we get the outcomes. So we do, we want consumer involvement in all MRFF funded research and in all of our initiatives. But there at the bottom of the slide, you can see that I pulled out 2 initiatives in particular. And these are ones that sort of have a more overt, I suppose, focus, consumer focus. The first one's the Emerging Priorities and Consumer Driven Research Initiative, and the title, mentions consumer there. The other initiative that I wanted to mention specifically today is the Preventative and Public Health Research Initiative. So this initiative, within the 10-year plan, there's actually $100 million $100 million over 10 years, that's specifically to support projects that identify and prioritise research that will most benefit patients and their families. Next slide, please, Fiona. So under that sort of specific $100 million over 10-year stream, our first grant opportunity that we've opened under that is the 2021 Consumer-Led Research Grant Opportunity. So under this grant opportunity, there's $10 million available. There's 2 different funding streams in this grant opportunity. I have on the slide here very much paraphrased. We always tell people you need to look at the details in the grant opportunity guidelines, but essentially one stream is about improving health self-efficacy, and the other stream is about using citizen science methodology for co-creating health knowledge. So I guess what's really relevant to today's discussion is that in our grant opportunity guidelines, we did not include a definition of what consumer-led means. And we did this for a couple of reasons. I guess one, across those 2 streams, consumer involvement and leadership might look different, but also because we wanted to leave it open so that more people could potentially see themselves in the objectives and the desired outcomes of this grant opportunity. So we do expect that in the applications that we receive, that there'll be a spectrum of consumer involvement and consumer leadership. So once those applications come in, we'll then have expert grant assessment committees that will assess the applications against the assessment criteria. And those criteria include things like impact, which I think for this grant opportunity is 40% of the score. Includes things about how the project engages with community and with consumers, and also about the capability and capacity of the research team. Do they have the appropriate skills to conduct this research that they're proposing? And I think probably at this point, I'd just like to say again that this is the first grant opportunity that we've delivered under that $100 million. So we're really keen to see how this goes, evaluate it and learn and improve for future grant opportunities. Next slide, please. So this slide, sorry, another busy one, but it's just to sort of illustrate the various points in MRFF implementation, where we're trying to engage with consumers and involve consumers. So I mean, overall, as I mentioned earlier on, we've got the guiding strategy and principles that AMRAB develops, and they do that following public consultation. We also have, for some of our grant opportunities, we do very closely work with consumers to figure out specific research questions. For example, there was from the Australian Breast Cancer Mission, a survivorship grant opportunity, and the research questions in that grant opportunity were developed through consultation with survivors of brain cancer. Then within all of our grant opportunity guidelines, we do try to encourage consumer involvement in the research projects. Then in the assessment phase, we have a consumer on every grant assessment committee. As I mentioned earlier too, a lot of our assessment criteria, maybe not consumer focused, and maybe we need to get there, but it does include how consumers are involved. The assessment criteria are heavily weighted towards impact. And in the sort of capability and capacity criterion, we're not just looking at the research team's publication track record, for example. We've tried to sort of expand that assessment criteria to the overall capacity and capability of the team. So that there aren't things that are necessarily stopping consumers from being part of the team on a grant. Then I guess when a grant is active, MRFF funds are allowed to be used to support consumer involvement. So whether that's paying consumers or paying consumer engagement managers. And then in the last step, I suppose, of a grant life cycle, if you're evaluating how things went, we also include consumers on our advisory panels when we do evaluations of the various MRFF initiatives. Next slide, please, Fiona. And just lastly, late in 2021, we got approval to establish an MRFF consumer reference panel. And we're really excited to be working with this group of consumers. So the purpose of this panel is to provide advice to the CEO of the Health and Medical Research Office on strategies for strengthening consumer involvement in MRFF implementation. So we've had one meeting so far. We've got another one coming up at the end of July. We've got a few more scheduled for later in the year. And the two things that we are going to be working with this panel to deliver in the first instance is developing some principles for consumer involvement in MRFF funded research. And then also we're going to work with the panel and get them to review and provide advice on our MRFF processes. So on our grant opportunity guidelines and on our assessment processes. I mean, I note in the chat that, you know, some people have mentioned that consumers don't score in MRFF processes, and some comments about how, you know, associate investigators are, you know, included and described in applications. So those are the sorts of things that we're really keen to learn more about with the support of this MRFF consumer reference panel, so we can, you know, improve and promote consumer involvement in MRFF grant funding going forward. So I think that's about it for me. I think the next slide is just a contact slide if people would like to know more about the MRFF.
Thank you so much, Helen. I just noted in the chat that Sarah Lukeman asked if you were able to share who's actually on the consumer reference panel.
Very soon. We haven't got our webpage up, it's drafted, but hopefully in the next week or two that'll be online.
How were they selected?
So we went out to a range of different organisations and asked for nominations. Okay. And then we reviewed those nominations. Most people on the panel have previous involvement in health and medical research. Mm-hmm. And we also really tried on this panel to get, you know, as much as we could, a cross-section of the Australian community, I suppose. So we've got sort of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, with people with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background or experience. So there's a range of different people on this panel.
Thank you so much, Helen. Just wanted to make a point on the importance of definitions, because that came up earlier. I think you've highlighted that it's particularly important when it comes to funding that we have clear definitions around how we label grants and the criteria that we use to assess grants. So I suppose, if nothing else, that's one key reason for having a very clear definition on what consumer-led research means versus consumer involvement. And clearly from the poll earlier this morning, the majority of people here today do think there is a difference between consumer involvement versus consumer research. Adam, I can see you nodding. So I'm going to throw across to you right now, because we're going to start to eat into Q&A time with attendees and the panel. But I'll just do a very brief introduction. So Adam, your role includes responsibility for funding call arrangements at NHMRCs, participation in a variety of international fora and working groups, as well as priority research areas such as dementia and mental health. Your experience covers policy development, program development, and management and stakeholder engagement in higher education and research. I'm sure I missed a sentence or I fluffed that up at the beginning. Sorry about that. I can't read my own writing. But welcome, Adam, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks everyone so far for the very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I haven't got any slides, so that will help me be a bit brief, so I won't have to, you know, sort of click through a series of slides that I've prepared. But I guess the key thing really for me to talk about is you know, NHMRC has been, encouraging. Doing its best to encourage the involvement and the consumer voice in research, health research and health delivery for a number of years. And of course, there's the statement that was issued in conjunction with the Consumer Health Forum in 2016, and that sort of was a very good, I guess, preliminary step. And since then, that's been built on with a series of toolkit resources, of which the most recent update was sort of towards the end of last year. And what we do have across all of our governing committees, we do have consumer representation. So on our council, on our research committee, on our new health research impact committee, on our ethics committee, and then those members also form in addition with some other members, also form our consumer and community advisory group that provides advice to the CEO on matters around consumer involvement and on consumer engagement in research. The topic of what consumer-led research hasn't come up into that space as yet, but we do have there are broad-ranging discussions that happen in that group, and the group had our usual triennium reshuffle last year, and so we've got a very good and active, engaged group this year. And so members were essentially chosen similar to the MRFF consumer group. We were looking for board representation, so we've got Indigenous representation, we've got call representation, we have people with lived experience and so on, and people who have previously worked in the consumer health space, on people who've had background on AIDS councils and those kind of broad community engagement groups. So it's actually a really good group we've got. So what I would talk about is a lot of our, as Helen indicated, a lot of our research is investigator-led. But we do have a small amount of targeted research, and some of that targeted research is probably where we've been able to kind of look more closely at how different ways we can involve consumers in not just the research process, but also in the evaluation of research and the peer review. So our targeted calls for research, those calls, the topics come about, they come through. There is a community portal where community representatives can put up topics, and then it goes to an evaluation committee. They can also come to us through parliamentary inquiries and so on. So some recent examples of some good consumer-led calls that have come up was the PFAS firefighting chemicals, which the funding for those projects did come from the Department of Defence, but that was certainly something that came up through community concerns and lobbying. There's also been the call around debilitating symptoms, Lyme-like disease attributed to ticks. And there's another one there that was MECFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. There are other ones there. So in those cases, in some of those, the community and the people with lived experience have helped formulate those research topics. The final outcomes, I think some of those projects have certainly got consumer representation in them, the extent of the engagement. I haven't looked deeply into those, but what we have been doing in those targeted calls for research, and also in our recent large mental health call that we ran through 2020, I think it was. With those ones, what we've been doing is trialing the use of consumers in the peer review process. So initially, I guess all of our peer review panels have had community observers just to make sure that the processes are followed, etc. But getting the consumer voice in is getting people who've got knowledge about the topics that are being considered. And so for a targeted call, a specific call, that's reasonably straightforward to organise, because you know who you're trying to get in. Whereas trying to do it for a much larger scheme is going to present a range of issues on how you formulate panels and so on. So for instance, doing ideas grant, not everything is going to have a consumer focus there. So what we have done is we've trialled, we're now getting to the process where we're going to look at trialling scoring, where the consumers don't just provide their view. Up to this point, they've provided a view, they've been involved in all the meetings, so they're considered as part of the panel, which is important. It's not a tack on, and that's one of our things I think that we're really trying to do in developing all our resources and so on, is not NHMRC saying, you have to do X, Y, and Z. What we're really doing is we're saying, well, we want the institutions and the researchers to be responsible for this, and to move it beyond that tick box exercise that has been raised in these discussions, because that's certainly something we don't want. Just yes, we just tick the box. That's okay. We're really trying to get a better sense of and a better understanding across researchers and institutions, because they're the ones that formulate the applications. So by the time it arrives to us at the final stage, it's kind of too late. So we can provide some guidance, but that deeper understanding is really what we're trying to, I guess, help foster that understanding across the research sector. So looking at that, we're still working on developing ways to involve consumers more, I guess, deeply in the peer review process. A good example, I noticed that in the comments and so on, there's the questions being posed about how do you get consumer-led in basic research, and that's tricky, and it's also tricky for consumer involvement or engagement. But I can point to one of our Research Excellence Award winners from this year, who won the Elizabeth Blackburn Prize for Basic Science. Yeah, I'm just waiting for it to come up. It's Professor Susan Ramos of the University of New South Wales. She had a whole lot of research on ovarian tissue analysis, and that's a basic science, and that it's working towards personalised medicine. But there was a lot of if you go to our website, there is actually a news item on there. If you search her up, and it gives you a bit of detail about how a lot of her work was really relied on ongoing engagement with consumers and people who have, who essentially the people who provided the samples for that study. So it is possible to get that consumer engagement in basic research. It's not always just researchers locked away in a lab, even though that might be part of it. But I think, yes, the broader question, I think there is this idea that consumer-led, I mean, any definition thing is going to be fraught. You're never really going to arrive at a very tight definition of what consumer-led research is. So I guess, particular calls could modify it a little bit. So for instance, with our mental health call, the main thing there was around lived experience, and we expected to see people with lived experience represented on the research team and also in the governance structures as well. So there are different ways you can do it, but I think the idea of what is consumer-led is going to always be a highly nuanced thing. But that just gives you a bit of an idea about where NHMRC is coming from and the work that how we're trying to, I guess, keep encouraging and keep doing what we can do to ensure that consumer voices and consumer engagement in research continues to expand.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. And in your discussion, then you referred to the statement on consumer and community participation in health and medical research, which was developed by the NHMRC and the Consumer Health Forum. We actually did invite a representative from the Consumer Health Forum to participate today, and they were super keen, but due to staff shortages because of illnesses, they were unable to commit, but they remain super interested in staying close to this topic. Is it time to maybe update that definition or include a definition in that statement that encompasses what consumer-led research means, particularly given that, I mean, even just here today, people seem to think there is a real difference between what consumer involvement is and what consumer-led research means?
It's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that. I think there may be some space to, I guess. Well, I'll have a think, because we are looking at how the statement currently sits. I don't know if we'd be comfortable in pushing out a definition, but there may be some space to actually include some wording around consumer-led.
Well, it wouldn't be a definition that didn't include consumer consultation.
No, that's right.
Given, right? So yeah, I wouldn't be expecting you to push out a definition without that involvement of consumers. Did anyone
actually earlier in the chat you'd posed this question: is it more about the research being led by patient public priorities and involving them in the research, rather than the research being led by the patients or the public themselves, where they become the researchers? Clarissa, you're nodding. I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously my expectation is not that every patient or carer gets a PhD and has all the skills to do full-on research, but I do think there's very easy capacity for the average research team to upskill a patient or a caregiver to be able to be an active contributor and have a leadership role within the process of developing, conducting, and disseminating the research. Even if it's just in an advisory capacity, but still maintaining that consistency and that leadership role in decision making is really important, rather than just having that tokenistic, we asked you a question one time and we got your feedback, but we may or may not actually use it.
Mm-hmm. There's also some comments about the ethics committees. Would they be right or not the right people to track the use of, having proper consumer engagement in the work? I mean, maybe a lot more is actually going on, but we have no way to track it, or it's not being documented. I mean, I look at research things that I'm, contributing to, but is it documented the level that I'm contributing to each project? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
I think, if I can interrupt, Christine, I think there is, this is reasonably unresolved, and I think, as I mentioned before, the source of funding is a great motivation for decisions to be made and definitions to carry through. And I'm pleased to hear Adam saying that there is the potential to look at this, and as the point I made before, in that the funding, excuse me, the funding should come with some accountability of consumer accountability in the process. And but that's my personal view, and pleased to see Adam is potentially moving that way, but just a little reluctant to take that too far today. But thank you.
There is a couple of questions that are sitting here. First, a couple for Helen. Are both carers and consumers on the panel? That comes from Peter in the chat.
On our consumer reference panel?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have some people with lived experience of cancer or dealing with the health system, and also some people in carer who've had sort of carer roles dealing with the health system as well. So both, yeah.
Okay. And another one from Murray in the Q&A. When will the MRFF change its current approach so that consumer reps on the assessment panels have their assessments included in the decision making about what gets funded?
Yeah, so I think probably firstly that they are in a way included in decision making at the moment. So the consumer representatives on the MRFF assessment committees, they do talk to all of the applications and provide their opinion on, how consumers are being engaged in the project. And the scoring panel members take that into consideration. However, perhaps what Murray's getting at is that they don't actually score. They're just providing advice that can influence the rest of the panel members' scores. So that's something that we're really keen to unpack with our consumer reference panel and understand from them, what do they think would be good to have? Do we want consumers to be scoring? There might sort of be nuances we need to think about then, like how many consumers do we need to put on a panel if they're going to be scoring? Do we want them scoring all criteria or just some? So it's definitely something that we're keen to work on with our consumer reference panel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's a couple more sitting here as well too. I'm just sort of having a quick chat because some of them have sort of been answered in a bit of a discussion. Mm-hmm. But Adam, one for you. When is the NHMRC going to have a consumer section as part of their applications?
Well, I would think that it would only get. I don't think there's any broad plan to add anything, but that always can change. Of course, the way that applications are structured is usually around the scoring matrix that's provided, the assessment matrix that's provided in all of our grant guidelines. So I would imagine that if there was a call of any kind that had a particular emphasis on consumers, then there may be some kind of provision made for that in the application process, but generally we would just expect if there's consumer engagement involvement in a project, then it would be incorporated as part of the general overall plan. But I think for our special initiative in mental health, I think we had a separate section there about that to talk about how they were doing their engagement and so on. So it does vary from scheme to scheme, but for the generic schemes, I'm not aware of anything that's in the pipeline at the moment. But
I just need to tell you the chat's kind of blowing up. So I think I might just hand it over back to Melinda and to Christine to see if they want to raise some of the key things out of the chat.
I did notice one of the questions that in grants like the MRFF consumer-led research, how can consumers be involved as CIs if they have to list like the criteria of top publications? So I was recently put on as a CI on a different research project, and because I've had publications, it was quite easy obviously for me to be able to list that. But there was a second CI that was a consumer that obviously didn't, and it still seemed to fit the criteria. So there is kind of that little bit of what I've seen, and I can't, for all projects, but in this particular case, there was that little bit of shift or that allowance that obviously she's not going to be at the level of having that, but her lived experience was too important to the actual research. So hopefully, as we move forward, we can make those kind of adjustments and allowances, knowing that they're not going to be able to come in at the level of a researcher, but what they can contribute is just as valuable.
Mm-hmm. Fiona, how are we going with the Q&A? Have you identified any more questions? Fiona's on mute. I'll let her keep sorting. And maybe I'll just put a question to the panel. It was one that came through prior to the webinar today, and it was an interesting question actually. What barriers are there from researchers to having consumers lead their research? Now, when we're talking about consumer-led research, I don't know that we're always necessarily talking about having consumers specifically lead a researcher's research. It can be consumers also involved in supporting researchers with their research. So Clarissa, maybe you might want to comment on this, given your experience, and Keith, I'd welcome any input from you as well.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. So I think it's absolutely reasonable for researchers to not necessarily want a consumer leading the whole entire thing. And that's also not feasible in most cases because of the expertise that's required to carry a project from start to finish. But I do think, like, as I mentioned before, there's an opportunity for collaboration. So if the researcher leading it is willing to work in equal partnership with the consumer and bridge the gap between their lived experience and the research knowledge that is and skill set that needs to be there to carry the project forward, I think that's, in my mind, the dream team for leading a research project.
Perfect. And Keith, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd certainly support Clarissa, but one of the focus areas of mine in particular is really translation and input of the research into practice. And I've seen statistics that it can take up to 17 years from the start of research through implementation. And I think one of the key benefits of having consumers accountable in the research is that the translation into practice is just so much more smooth and relevant. WeHire has demonstrated that having consumers sitting with researchers, buddy programs and various other activities really just emphasize the value of that consumer moving the process into translation a lot quicker. But that's a whole new area. But nevertheless, I think that's one of the key benefits of having consumers accountable for their research.
There also has been some discussion, and also Jane posed in the Q&A, lived experience researchers are common in mental health research. Is this truly patient-led? So there's quite a bit of discussion too about lived experience research.
Yeah. But I think we're all, you know, kind of, from what I'm gathering, in agreement about it being a partnership, it being a collaboration, not necessarily that the consumers are the ones actually driving it, leading it at the top, but they're actually there in every aspect. And the research projects that, you know, I've been involved in, it's not just the researchers. They, you know, like there's such a big team. There's statisticians that come in, or there's people from nursing or whatever it might be. Everyone's come from a different background as well as the consumers, but it's still being driven. But I think that's one of the biggest thing. I don't know, are we getting closer to a definition of consumer-led? But, you know, I mean, the outcome ultimately is a really good collaboration and partnership where the research is valuable and effective, and it matters to the patients and the consumers.
Yeah, I think it was probably ambitious to expect that we might derive at a clear definition of what research is today. We've got 3 minutes to achieve that goal, if anyone. But
do we put the poll up again and see if anyone's changed?
In terms of whether people think there is still a difference between consumer involvement and consumer-led. Well, I don't know. Actually, I haven't got access to the poll, Fiona. Are you able to create one very quickly? Maybe we can do that in the last few minutes and just see if people's views have changed. Also, whilst Fiona's doing that, there have been some questions that have come through, or requests for access to some of the presentations today. So I haven't had that discussion with the panelists. So I will follow up with each of the presenters after the session today and see if they're happy for their presentations to be shared. And if they are, we will definitely make them available to everyone that's attended today. And we will also be making this recording available on our website, recording of this session available on our website, and we'll also let you know when that is actually live. So yeah, I really want to take this opportunity whilst Fiona's still working out how to get that poll up.
Sorry, Christine, not going to happen today.
No, maybe we can send something out.
Yeah, I think so.
After the webinar today, and with a couple of other questions, just to see how people feel. You know, whether their perception of the definition has changed and where we're at. And then maybe as an action item, Adam, I can follow up with you offline and Consumer Health Forum about talking about where we maybe go to with next steps in bringing more clarity to consumer-led research.
Can I quickly, sorry, just jump in? I noticed that there's a few comments or questions around reimbursement or payment for consumers. For me personally, up until I was a CI on the week trial, any kind of payment may have been like a small reimbursement for time or travel or something like that. But when I became a CI on that week project, there was allocation for funding. So that for me was my first like official paid role. And it's changing. So any future applications that are going in for funding, there's discussion or there's inclusion for payment for consumers at that level.
Awesome.
Helen, you're nodding. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that for MRFF funding, yeah, it is counted as a direct research cost. So if it's, you know, an important part of the project, then applicants can put, you know, costs associated with involving consumers and consumer engagement people into their budgets and can spend funds on those things.
It may be one way to ensure engagement across the whole project. Because you're being paid, you can't drop off. Yeah,
I do support that, Melinda.
I saw your thumbs up.
Well, I can't believe we've actually kept to time. So yay, everybody, well done.
I just want to say I'm sorry we haven't got to all of the questions. I've tried, and also all of the questions that are sitting in the chat, but thanks to everyone who's participated in the chat. It's incredible.
Yeah, we'll process and synthesize all that information and try to get back to people with responses to anything that we haven't covered today. So stay tuned, and thank you very much to everybody once again for participating.
Amazing.
Today. Awesome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for having us.
Bye.